In this video, I'm going to show you pictures of neighboring villages of Rougeux and of Rougeux itself to give you an idea of the landscape and the living conditions of the people there in that region and how close the villages are to each other. Rougeux was founded well before the time of Christ. I have the Gallic and the Roman and the archaic French language used up until about 12 or 1300 AD, and of course the current spelling. It's certainly a fact that people have lived in this region for many, many years. The origin of the name Rougeux is something I have not been able to determine. It's a unique word that scholars, at least I haven't been able to find any that can give me the interpretation. There are a lot of Rougeaux in France, in Paris, and the United States, but they're from Normandy and the western part of Europe, and they're not related apparently. But anyway, I thought that showing you pictures would give you a better feeling of some of the things that are going to be said in subsequent videos. These photos were taken by myself, by my son Tom, and from Google Earth. I've also included at the end of these photos some historical information of interest. In order to illustrate the journey from Rougeux to Frenchville, I'm going to start backwards. We'll start at Frenchville, and I'll show you some photos here of the voyage from Rougeux. Our hardy ancestors began in 1835 or the fall of 1834. I don't know which of the two passages they took. Those are the only two that are available during this time frame. So it made a landlubber like our ancestors terribly seasick, without doubt. So the total walking distance from Le Havre to Rougeux, or Rougeux to Le Havre, was about 360 miles, according to the current routes. It may have been more then, because certainly they weren't paved and there wasn't any railroads or regular passenger service between Rougeux and Le Havre in 1835. This photo shows an elevation of about 3,000 feet above Rougeux and includes the Cistercian monastery or the Cistercian abbey. It's over the hill from Rougeux to the north about a mile, and that had an important factor in the long history of this village. So that in total they had a walking distance of about 600 miles and a voyage of well over 2,000 miles. I'm going to show aerial views and ground views of Rougeux and surrounding villages. This will give you a flavor of what's in this area and the surrounding villages. This first view is an aerial view taken from about 2,200 feet of Rougeux, and it shows the scattered housing there that have been probably in the same location for 1,000 of years or more, and also the 7 entrances to the village and the surrounding farmland. Tom Rougeux, one of my sons, took this picture in 2016 when he was there. He took various pictures as he drove along. The housing today is much more neat and kept, and lawns mowed and so forth. Certainly in contrast to what had to be in the earlier years before pavement and lawnmowers. And the time, of course, to worry about whether your grass is too long when you were trying to survive the vicissitudes that existed constantly in this area. In the far distance, a steeple rises over the gable roof of the hotel that was owned by Mrs. Marchand and her husband. You can see that this countryside is rolling and somewhat hilly. However, most of it is farmed with very little left to woods and unused areas. This was taken in the springtime, and so the leaves were just beginning to come out on the trees. The forests around there contain oak and chestnut and various trees similar to those found in the United States. The cemetery contains only one Rougeux. The practice in Europe, and it's fairly widespread, is to bury the person, and then after a number of years, when the grave site is needed again, to bury either on top or relocate the bones of the prior deceased into a smaller container and reuse the graves. So none of the ancient Rougeux or any ancient people graves are certainly in this area. That telephone booth in front of the cemetery certainly wasn't there in 1977 when I first visited. This is a view of the hotel today, or in 2016, and the little house there on the right is Mrs. Marshall's house. The porch on the hotel across the street has been revised since I was there. This is Mr. Marshall in front of his barn in 1979 when I was there. He died shortly after that. And this is Shirley and Mr. Marshall on the porch during that same visit. This is Shirley and Mrs. Marshall standing on the front porch of the hotel. This is the porch and door that I knocked on when I got off the cab and stood there, unable to get in because the door was locked. And this is where I was standing when Mrs. Marshall came out of her house across the street and hollered at me in French, "Qu'est-ce que tu veux?" So that's got some pretty good memories for me. Shirley and Mrs. Marshall were kindred spirits. They were both good people that enjoyed each other even though they couldn't speak a word of each other's language. But they knew instinctively each other on a spiritual basis. It was amazing how much fun they had together in the short time that we were there. This is a view of the church and the monument in front of the church that records the names of the men who died during World War I from this region. This is the inside of the Assumption of Blessed Virgin Mary Church. Notice the stovepipe there on the right. This is the same kind of heating system that was at Frenchville when I was a kid. It was not very effective when the weather was cold in that huge space. That's Shirley there in the background. It's another view of the church from outside. And another view of the village going east toward the end of the village. The road on the right eventually leads on up to Frenchville. And there's a switchback up the side of the mountain here. It doesn't seem very steep from here, but it was a pretty steep little hill. This is Shirley walking on the snow there. She really enjoyed visiting and seeing Rougeux. This is she and I in front of the sign on another visit during the summer. And this is her and I again. This is a view of Rougeux from the switchback on top of the hill. This is the first snow they had in 50 years. This is another view of going out into the country from Rougeux. This is a view of a farmer with his tractor. Another view of Rougeux and the countryside. This is an aerial photo by Google Earth of the region where the forthcoming photos will show these places. I'll start reading from the top center of this panel. The top paragraph center says that the site of Moulin-Jabard was first documented as being farmed by Rougeux, whose name was Jean, or John, and who was the son of Nicholas, in 1826. Going down the right side, the next arrow points to Montesson, a little village a half a mile east. Jean Rougeux, a cousin of our great-grandfather, lived there in 1756. And I know that from the marriage records of other people that had these friends who were documented on the marriage document as friends and where they lived and what they did. Going down the right side, the next arrow points to Montesson, a little village a half a mile east. Jean Rougeux, a cousin of our great-grandfather, lived there in 1756. And I know that from the marriage records of other people that had these friends who were documented on the marriage document as friends and where they lived and what they did. Going down the right side of the photo, the next arrow points to the road. The title of it is Moulin-Jabard. And then down in the right corner, it denotes that Pierrefetz is 1 mile to the southeast, which was the last location of my great-grandfather before he immigrated. Looking at the center of the photo, it says that Le Vendour farm house was there. It's in ruins. It was destroyed a century ago. And Rougeux lived there, but I'm not sure which one. I wasn't able to find that. Then center lower part, it talks about Leguite farm ruins. This farm, as you'll see from the pictures, is very, very extensive and very expensive construction. And I'll read the paragraph. It says Leguite was the first recorded relocation from Rougeux and occurred between 1756 and 1794. My great ancestor, maybe more greats, moved from Rougeux to there between those dates, and I wasn't able to focus any closer than that, but definitely he lived in Rougeux before 1756 and there at Leguite after 1794. These locations had expensive homes and outbuildings as well as significant prime acreage. The farming country around there is beautiful and are typical of manorial homes of the ruling class. I don't find anything in the centuries prior to that move that would indicate the ability to accumulate such prime properties or the funds to buy them. They probably were only laborers, but a permanent move changed their indicated place of residence. So I know that their home address after 1794 was Pierrefetz, which was the nearest large town, and not Rougeux. After my great-great-grandfather's death in 1811, his widow Marguerite and 4 infant sons continued living there until her remarriage in 1819. And then, of course, on the left side of the photo, it shows that Rougeux was 3.5 miles to the west, and Charmour, another little town there, is about half a mile away. And it shows the location of the Leguite farm ruins. So, anyway, that's the summary of their new location, close to 300 years ago now. This is a Leguite farm where my great-great-great-great-grandfather moved from Rougeux. This is Francois Geoffrain, who was such a key and pivotal source of information. Without him, I wouldn't know anything about this stuff, and I would never be able to write it in a book, and so that you can know too. You can see from the size of the buildings and the extensive walls that it took a lot of funds and labor to do this. This is the inside of the house and shows how ruined it is. Another view of the outside door there. And this is a close-up of the door into the house. Another view of the ruins inside the building. Another view. This is part of a roof tile that was used on the building. This is the house on Moulin Jabard Road. The notation on this photo up in the right-hand corner says that 3 farms were owned by Rougeux since at least 1764. I've been in contact with the son of the Rougeux that lived there last. He's on Facebook. His name is Gerard. Recent news, 11/15/2016, new owners were rehabilitating the property as their permanent home. And I understand that they've progressed with that, but I don't have any current reports. The other 2 farms are further up Moulin Jabard Road. As I said earlier, this place was sold and is being rehabilitated. This notation here with the arrow pointing toward the eave of the roof says that the notation discusses the radiused eaves which are stone, which were cut and displayed on the front of this house. According to Francois Geoffrain, this little bit of ornament indicated financial success, and it's hard to believe that Rougeux, based on the information I have, were able to buy this, but I don't know. Apparently they did somehow, and the farm around it. That hole in the side there is an entrance to a pipe that extended overhead across the road into a well or a spring. Francois told me that he's got some information that grapes were grown on this property, but the wine that was made from it was not very high quality and was sold in Paris, which meant that the poor people in Paris were drinking wine from this property. This is Moulin Rouge continuing north. This is a view of the abandoned Cistercian monastery, about a mile over the hill from Rougeux as the crow flies. This monastery was established in about the 11th century and was active with monks until roughly the French Revolution, when it was destroyed and disbanded. This monastery owned Rougeux and required tithes to be paid from the citizens of Rougeux for about 300 years. This is Pierre Fetz, and is the home address of the last place of residence for my great-grandfather before they departed from there in 1835. One characteristic of most villages is the fact that they have their own church, even though they're within sight of each other, a mile or 2 apart. This is the house that Francois and Marjorie Geoffrain live in. It's just on the street from the church. This is a photograph of Francois and Marjorie Geoffrain. Again, I want to say thanks is an inadequate word for the work that he did and the research that he did for me
in getting the information together. Without him, there wouldn't have been any books or knowledge of our past history. He's really a kind, gentle man. Francois was a retired teacher and a genealogist by hobby. And so when he volunteered to help find my relatives, it was a stroke beyond my wildest dreams. I'll talk more about that later in the videos, but I just want to introduce Francois now so you know who I'm talking about. He did an enormous amount of work in rooting around in the ancient files of the region there and made hand copies of countless documents and had them all bound up in a little book and sent them to me. And he found works of 2 different abbots who wrote histories of the region and sent those to me too. So I found treasure there that I don't know if anybody else in this world would have been able to find other than through my own dumb luck and fortune to be able to go there and all the circumstances that came up to make all that possible. But from his work I was able to really write 2 books, Survival and The Long Journey. The family of my name are as well documented back to ancient times as it's, I think, possible. So with that introduction, we'll go on with the subject at hand. It's a nice little village, very old houses, well kept and maintained today. But I suspect that at the time of immigration, the streets obviously were dirt and mud, and it probably was not nearly so charming as it is today. This church here at Frenchville, which is only a couple miles from Rougeux, is astonishing in its size and beauty. Frenchville is kind of a center point where there are a lot of shopping malls. Well, there are some shopping malls, or most of the surrounding area comes by their goods and so forth. Whereas most of the villages don't have stores. Notice the sign there, it says Rougeux. There's a bank there, and it's considerably larger. This is an overhead view of Frenchville, and you can see that it's much more dense and populated. During my research, I found that a fire which had started there in 1667, as indicated down the lower part of the photo, and it burned quite a bit of the village. In fact, flames and sparks flew over to Pierrefitte. It was such a raging fire, so I suspect it was pretty well demolished. Forts is a town about 12 miles northwest of Rougeux, and it's been the target of a number of very devastating attacks over the centuries. One of the stories that I found at least once, the last 1,000 years or so, roving criminals came there, anti-Christian people, and smeared human feces on the inside of the church. The pastor burnt the church down as being too contaminated to salvage. There are a number of interesting stories and anecdotes in my books, The Long Journey and the book Survival, about Horts. It certainly went through a lot of turmoil. This is Langres. It's a walled city on top of a hill about 25 miles west of Rougeux. It's really unique. If you're ever in the region, you need to stop and visit it. It's been the site of many terrible battles, generally with the Germans, who are constantly invading France, and the ground is well soaked with human blood. There's a lot of interesting tales about that in my books that I've recorded. Leprosy was brought into the region after the return of the Crusaders in 1350 or so, and it spread around quite a large area in Europe and persisted for, well, 400, 500 years. Now, this view shows the location of the ruins of Leprosarium at Pierrefitte, which is only 2.5 miles or so as a crow flies from Rougeux. There was another leprosarium nearby. I couldn't find the location of it, and I couldn't find anybody that knew where it had been. This photograph was taken on Miller, my nephew. The people that contracted leprosy were confined to these places, and they were not allowed to associate with anybody. And if they left the building, they had to carry a bell to warn other people away. They were supported by charity, but I can't believe that they were able to even survive, because the surrounding areas were constantly attacked by one disaster or another, and there was not a lot left for generosity to lesser lucky ones. So I suspect those poor people had a terrible life. Well, after it was discovered, before they were confined there, they had a funeral mass for them, because essentially they were dead to human life. This is a picture of Giselle Mignot Rougeux, who was a relative of my grandmother. Grandma Rougeux was a Mignot, and she was the daughter of Hyacinth Mignot, who immigrated to Frenchville in about 1845. Found that where she lived, and Shirley and I visited. We had a great visit, although they couldn't speak very good English. But her husband there, has a great story of his survival of World War II, and he was just a young boy then. But to escape punishment or enslavement, he lived in the woods for almost 4 years, only coming home periodically at night for food and sustenance. They only lived about 5 miles from Rougeux, but I doubt if they ever knew our relatives at the time they were all living there. 5 miles in those days was like 5,000 today. This is a little bit of information, the 17th century, and shows, and it's not atypical of this particular century. These types of disasters are just repetition from one century to another. This is a list of families who lived in Pierre Fetz and who departed there, and our name is on there. This is a map of the recapture of Rougeux from the Germans in August and September of 1944. And my cousin Francis was part of that advancement through Rougeux, and he was the source of knowledge that this village by the name of Rougeux actually existed, which he told me when he returned in 1945. Coincidentally, another Francis Rougeux, sergeant in the army, was killed to the north near Bastogne in January 1945.
I think we'll end this one here now. We'll go to the next video.